Gabriel Harris leaned against the cold glass of his penthouse window, the city below a sea of lights and chaos he no longer felt part of. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, sharp and unrelenting. You cannot have children. For years, Gabriel had dominated boardrooms and built an empire that spanned continents. He was untouchable, unstoppable. But this was something his wealth and power couldn't fix. The weight of it pressed down on him until he couldn't breathe. His legacy, the very thing he had sacrificed everything for, was gone. A glass of whiskey sat untouched on the table. For once, the burn wouldn't be enough to drown the noise in his head. Gabriel grabbed his car keys, desperate for escape. The rain pelted down as he drove aimlessly through the city, the rhythmic thud of the wipers doing little to calm his stormy thoughts. He barely noticed as the buildings gave way to quieter streets, his hands gripping the wheel tighter with every passing mile. Suddenly, a sharp curve appeared. Gabriel's reflexes, dulled by his distracted state, failed him. The tires screeched against the wet pavement, the car spinning out of control. "Damn it!" he shouted, the steering wheel useless in his grip. The car careened off the road, slamming into a tree. The world went black. Gabriel woke to the sound of rain and the faint sensation of someone pulling at his arm. His vision blurred as he tried to focus. "Hey, can you hear me? Stay with me," a voice urged, firm yet full of concern. He blinked, his eyes finally settling on the figure of a woman, her rain-soaked hair plastered to her face. She was small but determined, tugging at him with all her strength. "What?" he mumbled, his head pounding. "Your car's about to catch fire," she said, urgency dripping from every word. "You need to move. Now." Pain shot through his legs as he tried to shift. "I can't." "Yes, you can," she cut him off, her tone brooking no argument. "I'm not leaving you here." Somehow, she managed to pull him free of the wreckage, her strength fueled by sheer willpower. As they stumbled away, the car erupted into flames, lighting up the night sky. Gabriel collapsed onto the wet ground, gasping for air. The woman crouched beside him, checking his injuries. Who are you?" he asked between breaths. "Elena Brooks," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And you're lucky I was driving by." "Lucky," he muttered, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "That's one word for it." Elena frowned. "You don't sound very grateful for someone who just cheated death." He looked at her, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "I'm grateful," he said, though his tone carried an edge of sarcasm. "But I'm not sure I deserve to be saved." Her expression softened, but only slightly. "Well, I wasn't going to let you die tonight. You can figure out the rest later." Hours later, Gabriel sat in a hospital bed, his injuries thankfully minor. The nurses bustled around him, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Elena, the stranger who had risked her life for his. When the nurse returned to check his vitals, he asked, "The woman who brought me here, where is she?" "She left," the nurse replied. "Said she had to get to work." "Work?" He raised an eyebrow. "She mentioned being a nurse. She's probably back on her shift already," the nurse said before leaving him to his thoughts. Gabriel leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't remember the last time someone had done something for him without expecting something in return. It stirred something in him he didn't fully understand. For the first time in years, Gabriel Harris felt the faint stirrings of hope, and it terrified him. Gabriel Harris sat in the back of his sleek black town car, the city lights streaking past the rain-speckled windows. His assistant's voice buzzed through his earpiece, listing meetings and deadlines. But he wasn't listening. His mind was on her, Elena Brooks, the woman who had saved his life. He'd spent the last 2 weeks obsessing over her, replaying that night in his mind. He hadn't seen her since the hospital, but the determination in her eyes, the sheer will that had pulled him from the wreckage, lingered with him. It was a rare thing to encounter someone like that. "Cancel my morning," he interrupted his assistant abruptly. "What? Sir, you have." "I said, cancel it," Gabriel snapped, ending the call. He'd had his people track her down. It hadn't been difficult. There weren't many nurses named Elena Brooks living in the city. She worked at a small clinic on the east side, far from the world of luxury and power he inhabited. The clinic was a stark contrast to the polished steel and glass towers Gabriel was accustomed to. The walls were painted a faded beige, the waiting room full of worn chairs and frayed magazines. He stood awkwardly by the door, unsure why he'd come. "Can I help you?" The receptionist asked, eyeing his tailored suit with suspicion. I'm here to see Elena Brooks, he said, his voice more commanding than he intended. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. She's busy with patients. Do you have an appointment? Not exactly, but Gabriel? He turned to see her standing in the hallway, clipboard in hand. She looked different out of the chaos of that night, calmer, more in control. Her hair was pulled back and her scrubs were plain, but there was something striking about her presence. Elena, he said, taking a step forward. Wanted to thank you, properly. Her expression flickered with surprise. Then something else. Amusement, perhaps. You could have sent flowers like a normal person. I thought this would be more personal, he admitted, feeling uncharacteristically awkward. She glanced at the receptionist, who was watching the exchange with open curiosity. Come on, Elena said, motioning for him to follow. Her office was tiny, more of a storage closet than a proper workspace. She gestured for him to sit in the lone chair while she perched on the edge of her desk. I wasn't expecting to see you again, she said, crossing her arms. I don't usually make it a habit to track people down, he replied, leaning forward. But you saved my life. That's not something I take lightly. Elena tilted her head, studying him. Most people wouldn't have bothered. I'm not most people. No, she agreed, a small smile playing on her lips. You're clearly not. There was a moment of silence, and Gabriel felt an unfamiliar discomfort under her gaze. He was used to commanding rooms, dominating conversations, but Elena seemed unimpressed by his presence. I want to help you, he said suddenly. Her smile faded. Help me? I have resources, money, connections. If there's anything you need. I don't need your charity, she interrupted, her tone sharp. It's not charity, he insisted. It's gratitude. Let me repay you. Elena stood, her arms dropping to her sides. You think because you're rich, you can just fix things with a check? That's not how it works in my world, Mr. Harris. Gabriel, he corrected softly. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Look, I appreciate the gesture, but I don't need saving. I've been taking care of myself for a long time. Clearly, he said, standing as well. But what if I just wanted to help because I respect what you've been through? Her eyes softened, but she shook her head. I don't think you understand what you're asking. Then help me understand, he countered. Elena finally relented, telling him about her husband and son, lost in a fire 3 years ago. She spoke with a detached calm, as though the pain had burned itself out, but Gabriel could see the shadows in her eyes. I didn't save you because I wanted something in return, she said when she finished. I did it because it was the right thing to do. That's it. Maybe, he said, meeting her gaze. But that doesn't mean you have to face everything alone. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not your responsibility, Gabriel. Maybe not, he admitted, but I'm here anyway. For the first time, her expression softened completely, and Gabriel felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Fine, she said finally, but no grand gestures, no checks. If you want to help, start by showing up like a normal person. Deal, he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. As he left the clinic, Gabriel felt lighter than he had in weeks. For once, he wasn't thinking about what he couldn't have. He was thinking about what might still be possible. Gabriel Harris wasn't used to waiting, but here he was, sitting in the crowded waiting room of the clinic for the third time that week. The hum of conversations, the occasional wail of a child, and the distant murmur of phones ringing blended into a background he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the hallway, waiting for a glimpse of Elena Brooks. She had reluctantly allowed him into her life. On her terms, of course. No extravagant gestures, no checks, no sweeping offers of salvation. Just show up, she'd said, and so he did. The door to one of the exam rooms opened, and Elena emerged, her expression focused but weary. She glanced his way, her brow furrowing as if silently questioning why he was still there. Gabriel stood and approached her, his steps confident but careful. Mr. Harris, she said, folding her arms. Gabriel, he corrected, for what felt like the 100th time. I told you, call me Gabriel. And I told you to stop lurking in my waiting room, she countered, a trace of amusement in her tone. I'm not lurking, he said, leaning casually against the wall. I'm waiting. Big difference. Elena shook her head, but didn't tell him to leave. What do you want? I thought I'd take you to lunch, he said. Her eyebrows shot up. Lunch? Yes, you know, the meal that comes after breakfast and before dinner? Usually involves food? I know what lunch is, she said, fighting back a smile. But why me? Because you've been working all day and probably haven't eaten, he replied. And because I'd like to spend some time with you without a stethoscope involved. Elena hesitated, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for hidden motives. Finally, she sighed. Fine, but it's your fault if I regret this. The diner they ended up in was a far cry from Gabriel's usual Michelin-starred haunts. The booths were patched with duct tape, and the menu looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. But Elena seemed at ease here, and that was enough for him. As they slid into a booth, a waitress appeared with a notepad and a smile. What can I get you to? I'll have the turkey club and a coffee, Elena said without hesitation. Gabriel glanced at the laminated menu. The same. And water, please. The waitress nodded and left them alone. So, Elena began, leaning back in the booth. Why are you really here, Gabriel? I told you, he said, meeting her gaze. Lunch. And? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. You intrigue me. Her eyes narrowed. That's not an answer. Fine, he said, leaning forward. You saved my life, Elena. That's not something I can ignore. And now that I know a little more about you, I want to know more. You're not like anyone I've ever met. Elena tilted her head, studying him. You don't know me, Gabriel. Not really. Then let me, he said softly. For a moment, she didn't respond, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. Finally, she said, All right, but there are things about me you might not like. Try me, he said, his voice steady. She glanced at him, her eyes shadowed. I told you about the fire, but what I didn't tell you is that I blame myself for it. My husband and son were home because I asked them to wait for me. If I hadn't... Stop, Gabriel interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. You can't carry that alone. You couldn't have known. Elena looked away, her jaw tightening. Maybe not, but that doesn't change how I feel. Gabriel leaned back, letting her words hang in the air. He wasn't sure what to say, and he doubted she wanted platitudes. Instead, he said, You're stronger than you realize. She met his gaze, her eyes softening just a little. And you're more persistent than I expected. By the time they left the diner, the awkward tension between them had lessened. As they walked toward her car, Gabriel asked, Will you let me take you to dinner next time? Elena laughed, the sound light and genuine. Let's see how I feel about lunch first. He smiled, watching as she climbed into her car and drove away. For the first time in a long while, Gabriel felt like he was moving towards something real, something worth fighting for. The days following their lunch blurred into a new routine. Gabriel found himself drawn to Elena in ways he couldn't explain, and to his surprise, she didn't push him away as often as he'd expected. He began showing up at the clinic, not to wait in the lobby, but to pick her up after work. They started spending more time together, though Elena remained cautious, as if constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. One evening, as Gabriel parked outside her modest apartment building, he glanced at the dimly lit windows. It wasn't the kind of place he'd imagined for someone as resilient and capable as Elena. You don't have to walk me up, she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. I'm not letting you go up alone, Gabriel replied firmly. Elena gave him a look. Gabriel, I've been walking myself home since I was 18. I think I've got it handled. He smirked. You can't win this one. She sighed, rolling her eyes. Fine, but don't make a habit of this. People might start talking. They walked to her door in companionable silence, the sound of distant sirens breaking the quiet. As Elena fished for her keys, Gabriel's gaze drifted to the darkened hallway. This place doesn't feel safe, he said. She shot him a look. It's fine. I've lived here for years. That doesn't mean it's safe, he countered. Let me help you find a better place. Elena turned to face him fully, her expression guarded. We've had this conversation. I don't need your money, Gabriel. I'm not offering money. I'm offering peace of mind, he said, his voice calm but insistent. She shook her head. Peace of mind doesn't come from four walls. It comes from knowing you can handle yourself. Gabriel fell silent, watching her unlock the door. He admired her stubbornness, even if it frustrated him. Later that night, Gabriel sat in his penthouse, a glass of whiskey untouched on the coffee table. His assistant had left a stack of files for him to review, but he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to Elena's apartment, to the faint unease he'd felt in the hallway. The sound of his phone vibrating pulled him from his thoughts. The caller ID read, Victor Crane. Gabriel sighed and answered. Victor, he said. Gabriel, I'm glad I caught you. We need to talk about the merger, Victor said, his tone brisk. I told you, I'll look at the documents tomorrow. Tomorrow's too late, Victor snapped. You've been distracted, Gabriel. What's going on with you? This isn't like you. Gabriel's jaw tightened. I'm handling it. You'd better be, Victor said coldly. Because if you're not, someone else will. The line went dead. Gabriel stared at the phone, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Victor had always been ambitious, but lately his tone had grown sharper, more threatening. The next morning, Gabriel returned to the clinic to see Elena. He found her in the break room, sipping coffee and reviewing a patient chart. You look tired, he said, leaning against the doorway. She glanced up, her lips curving into a faint smile. You're one to talk. He stepped inside, lowering his voice. Elena, I need to ask you something. She set the chart down, her smile fading. What's wrong? Nothing, he said quickly. Not yet, anyway. But I need to know, if things get complicated, if my world starts to bleed into yours, will you trust me? Her brows furrowed. What are you talking about? There are people in my life, business partners, who don't always play fair, he admitted. I need to know that you'll let me protect you if things get messy. Elena crossed her arms, her gaze steady. Gabriel, I don't need protection. I'm not some damsel in distress. I know that, he said, but this isn't about you being strong. It's about me being involved, about me caring. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than he'd intended. Elena looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, if it comes to that, we'll figure it out. Together. Gabriel exhaled, relief washing over him. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, she said, her voice softening. You might regret letting me in. He smiled. Not a chance. That night, as Gabriel returned to his penthouse, he found an envelope waiting for him on the kitchen counter. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message typed in bold letters. Stay away from her, or you'll regret it. His grip tightened on the note, his mind racing. Victor? Someone else? It didn't matter. What mattered was keeping Elena safe, and whoever had sent the message was about to learn just how far Gabriel Harris would go to protect the people he cared about. The note burned a hole in Gabriel's mind, its blunt threat refusing to leave him alone. He sat in his penthouse office, his hands steepled under his chin, staring at the offending piece of paper on the desk. His instincts screamed at him to act, but for once, he hesitated. Whoever sent this knew about Elena, and that made her a target. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Elena. Gabriel, she said, her voice calm but cautious. You okay? You've been quiet all day. I'm fine, he lied, though he wasn't sure why. Just caught up with work. There was a pause on the other end. Don't let Victor drag you into his mess. You sounded off yesterday. Gabriel's grip tightened on the phone. I can handle Victor. I'm sure you can, she said, though there was an edge to her tone. But if there's something you're not telling me, you should know I don't scare easily. He hesitated, then said, It's nothing you need to worry about. Another pause. All right, but if it's about me, you'll tell me, won't you? Yes, he said quickly, though the word felt heavy on his tongue. I'll tell you. The next morning, Gabriel walked into his company's headquarters with a determination that left no room for hesitation. He called Victor Crane into his office and shut the door behind him. Victor leaned casually against the desk, his smirk as sharp as ever. What's this about, Gabriel? We've got bigger things to deal with than impromptu meetings. Gabriel tossed the note onto the desk in front of him. Recognize this? Victor's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. Should I? You tell me, Gabriel said coldly, stepping closer. Because if I find out you had anything to do with this, Victor, I'll make sure you regret it. Victor picked up the note, turning it over in his hands. You think I sent this? That I'm playing games with you? You've been gunning for my position for months. Gabriel shot back. You've made it clear you'll do whatever it takes to win. So tell me, why shouldn't I think this is you? Victor's smirk returned, though his eyes were colder now. Because I don't waste my time with threats. If I wanted to take you down, Gabriel, you'd already know it. Gabriel didn't flinch. Stay away from Elena. If I find out you've even looked in her direction. Victor laughed, the sound low and mocking. You've gone soft. A year ago, you wouldn't have let anyone see this side of you. Now you're letting a woman make you vulnerable. Gabriel's jaw tightened. I'm warning you, Victor. Victor shrugged, dropping the note onto the desk. You've got your warning. Now here's mine. Watch your back. Not everyone in this city plays by the rules. Later that evening, Gabriel picked up Elena from the clinic. She noticed his tense expression the moment she slid into the passenger seat. You're brooding again, she said lightly, though concern laced her voice. What's going on? He hesitated, gripping the steering wheel. I need you to stay at my place for a while. What? She asked, turning to face him fully. Why? It's safer, he said simply. She frowned. Gabriel, what aren't you telling me? He exhaled, pulling into the parking lot of a nearby cafe. Once the car was in park, he turned to her. Someone sent me a threat about you. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't flinch. A threat? What kind of threat? They want me to stay away from you, he said, his voice low. And I can't risk ignoring it. Elena folded her arms, her gaze unwavering. So your solution is to move me into your fortress of a penthouse? Yes, he said firmly, until I figure out who's behind this. She shook her head. Gabriel, I can't just uproot my life because someone's trying to scare you. This isn't about me, he said sharply. It's about you. I won't let anyone hurt you, Elena. Her expression softened, though her voice remained steady. And what happens if they come after you instead? What then? I can handle myself, he said, his tone final. Please, Elena, just let me protect you. After a long pause, she nodded. All right, but only because I know you won't drop this. That night, Elena moved into the guest room of Gabriel's penthouse. She carried little more than a duffel bag and a stubborn determination not to let fear control her life. As she unpacked, Gabriel knocked on the open door. You comfortable? She glanced over her shoulder. As comfortable as I can be under the circumstances. He leaned against the doorframe, his hands in his pockets. Elena, I mean it. I'll handle this. I know you will, she said softly, but don't lose yourself in the process. Gabriel studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good night, Elena. Good night, Gabriel. As he walked away, Gabriel felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. He'd done everything he could to keep her safe, but the game was far from over. Whoever had sent that note wasn't finished yet, and Gabriel knew the only way to end it was to confront them head on. The days in Gabriel's penthouse stretched into a week. Elena adjusted to her new environment, though she couldn't shake the sense of unease. She moved through the sleek, modern space with care, her eyes constantly flicking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Gabriel had doubled his security detail, but it didn't ease her nerves. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen, Gabriel poured her a glass of wine and leaned against the counter, his eyes scanning her face. You're quiet, he said. I'm thinking, Elena replied, tracing the rim of her glass, about why someone would go through so much trouble to scare us. Me, he corrected. They're trying to scare me. Her gaze met his, sharp and unyielding. No, Gabriel. This is about us. They want to break whatever this is before it starts. Gabriel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the window, staring out at the city lights. Victor claims he didn't send the note. And you believe him? She asked, her tone skeptical. No, Gabriel admitted, but Victor doesn't usually play games. If he wanted to undermine me, he'd do it directly. Then who? Elena pressed. I don't know, he said, his voice tight, but I'm going to find out. The next morning, Gabriel returned to his office with a renewed focus. His security team had traced the note back to a third-party courier service, but the trail ran cold. Frustrated, he turned his attention to his business dealings, searching for enemies he might have overlooked. Hours later, his assistant entered the office, a worried expression on her face. Mr. Harris, there's a visitor here for you, she said hesitantly. Who? Gabriel asked, not looking up from his computer. They wouldn't give a name, she said, but they insisted you'd want to see them. Gabriel frowned, his instincts immediately on edge. Send them in. The door opened, and a man in his late 40s stepped inside. His suit was expensive but understated, and his demeanor exuded confidence. Gabriel's eyes narrowed as he stood to greet the man. You have 5 minutes, Gabriel said coldly. Make them count. The man smiled faintly. Mr. Harris, my name is Stephen Blackwood. I represent certain interests that have a stake in your decisions. Interests, Gabriel repeated, his tone icy. And what decisions are you referring to? The ones involving Miss Brooks, Blackwood said smoothly. You see, her presence complicates matters for people who prefer their dealings with you to remain strictly professional. Gabriel's jaw tightened. So you're the one who sent the note. Blackwood raised an eyebrow. Let's just say I'm here to offer a solution. Here's my solution, Gabriel said, his voice low and dangerous. You and your interests stay away from Elena. If you don't, you'll regret it. Blackwood's smile didn't waver. This isn't a threat, Mr. Harris. It's a warning. Miss Brooks is a liability, for you and for her. If you care about her, you'll let her go. Gabriel took a step forward, his eyes blazing. Get out of my office. Now. Blackwood held his ground for a moment, then nodded. Consider my advice, Mr. Harris. It might save you both a great deal of trouble. As the door closed behind him, Gabriel's hands clenched into fists. He'd dealt with power plays before, but this was different. This was personal. That evening, Gabriel returned to the penthouse, his anger barely contained. He found Elena in the living room, a book open on her lap. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening. What happened? She asked, setting the book aside. Gabriel hesitated, then sat beside her on the couch. Someone came to see me today. They claim you're a liability. Elena frowned. A liability? To what? To me. To my business. To whatever twisted game they're playing, he said, his voice heavy with frustration. And what did you say? She asked. I told them to stay the hell away from you, he said firmly. Elena reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. Gabriel, you can't fight this alone. I'm not letting them hurt you, he said, his voice soft but resolute. I won't lose you, Elena. Her eyes searched his, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. Then we'll face this together. Late that night, Gabriel stood on the balcony, the cool breeze brushing against his skin. He replayed Blackwood's words in his mind, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. Whatever it took, he would protect Elena. From the shadows of the penthouse, Elena watched him, her own thoughts racing. For all his strength and determination, Gabriel carried a burden she couldn't take away. But she would stand by him, no matter what came next. The days following Blackwood's visit were tense. Gabriel's security team worked around the clock, scouring every lead they could find, but progress was slow. Whoever was pulling the strings had taken careful steps to remain hidden, and it frustrated Gabriel to no end. Elena, on the other hand, refused to be a passive observer. She had always been independent, and the idea of being protected like a fragile object grated on her nerves. One evening, after Gabriel returned from the office visibly exhausted, she decided it was time to confront him. Gabriel, she said, standing in the doorway of his office as he sat slumped in his chair. We need to talk. He looked up, his tie loosened and his face shadowed with worry. What about? This, she said, stepping into the room. All of it, the threats, the secrecy, the way you're carrying all of this on your shoulders. I'm handling it, he said, his voice tight. No, you're not, she replied, her tone firm but not unkind. You're shutting me out. You think by keeping everything from me, you're protecting me, but you're just making it harder for both of us. Gabriel sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't want you to worry. I'm already worried, Elena said, crossing her arms. But I'm also capable of handling the truth. So, tell me what's going on. He hesitated, then gestured for her to sit. She did, leaning forward as he began to speak. There's a man named Stephen Blackwood, Gabriel said. He works for someone or some group that sees you as a threat to my business. He came to my office and warned me to let you go. Elena's brow furrowed. Why me? I'm just a nurse. I don't have anything to do with your company. They think your presence distracts me, he said bitterly. That being with you makes me vulnerable. And what do you think? She asked, her voice softer now. I think they're right, he admitted. You do make me vulnerable, Elena, but not in the way they think. You make me care about something other than money and power, and that terrifies them. Elena reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. Gabriel, you don't have to face this alone. Let me help. How? He asked, his voice tinged with frustration. You can't fight these people. No, she said, but I can stand by you, and if they see that we're stronger together, maybe they'll think twice about trying to break us. He looked at her, his expression softening. You're incredible, you know that? She smiled faintly. I've been told. The next morning, Gabriel made a decision. He called a meeting with Victor and his legal team, determined to send a message to whoever was watching. Victor walked into the boardroom with his usual smugness, but Gabriel cut him off before he could speak. "Sit down," Gabriel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Victor raised an eyebrow but complied. The rest of the team exchanged uneasy glances as Gabriel stood at the head of the table. "We have a problem," he began. "Someone has been interfering in my personal life, and I won't tolerate it." Victor leaned back in his chair, feigning innocence. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Gabriel." "I'm not implying anything," Gabriel shot back. "I'm stating a fact. Whoever is behind this needs to know that I won't be intimidated." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Mr. Harris, if this involves a personal matter—" "It stopped being personal the moment they threatened my business," Gabriel interrupted. "This is about control, and I won't let them have it." Victor smirked. "Strong words, but threats only work if you know who you're dealing with." Gabriel's gaze narrowed. "Then maybe it's time we find out." Later that evening, Gabriel returned to the penthouse feeling more resolved than he had in days. Elena was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something that smelled delicious. "How'd it go?" she asked without looking up. "As well as it could," he said, leaning against the counter. "Victor's playing his games, but I made it clear I'm not backing down." Elena glanced at him, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "Good. They need to know you're not someone they can push around." He smiled faintly. "You're starting to sound like my lawyer." She smirked. "Maybe I missed my calling." As they sat down to dinner, the tension between them seemed to ease. For the first time in weeks, Gabriel felt a sliver of hope that they might come out of this stronger. But as they finished eating, his phone buzzed with a message. He picked it up, his expression darkening as he read the words. "You've been warned. Don't make us prove we're serious." Elena noticed his change in demeanor. "What is it?" He hesitated, then handed her the phone. She read the message, her jaw tightening. "This isn't going to stop, is it?" she said quietly. "No," Gabriel admitted, "but neither am I." Elena placed the phone on the table, meeting his gaze. "Then we fight back, together." For the first time, Gabriel didn't argue. He simply nodded, his resolve hardening. Whoever was behind this had underestimated them, and they were about to learn just how dangerous that mistake could be. The tension in Gabriel's penthouse was palpable. The message from the night before had shifted the atmosphere, and both he and Elena knew the stakes were higher than ever. Gabriel spent the morning on the phone with his security team, barking orders and demanding updates. Elena watched from the kitchen, her coffee untouched as she tried to make sense of it all. Finally, she couldn't take the silence any longer. She crossed the living room and stood in the doorway of Gabriel's office. "You're going to burn yourself out," she said softly. Gabriel glanced up from his desk, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "I don't have time to rest, Elena. Not until this is over." She stepped inside, leaning against the edge of his desk. "You're no good to anyone if you're running on fumes. Let me help." He leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. "How? You're already in the crosshairs because of me." "I'm in the crosshairs because someone thinks they can use me to hurt you," she corrected. "And that's not going to stop unless we figure out who's behind this." "I'm trying," he said, his frustration evident. "But whoever they are, they're careful. Every lead hits a dead end." "Then we need to stop playing defense," Elena said firmly. "We need to make them come to us." Gabriel stared at her, a mixture of admiration and apprehension in his eyes. "That's a dangerous game." "So is doing nothing," she replied. Later that day, Gabriel called a meeting with his head of security, a no-nonsense man named Grant. Elena sat quietly beside him, listening as they discussed options. "We've tightened surveillance around your property and your office," Grant said, flipping through a file. "But whoever sent that message isn't leaving a trail. They know what they're doing." "What about the courier service?" Gabriel asked. Grant shook his head. "A dead end. The order was placed online using an untraceable IP." Gabriel clenched his fists. "Then we need to change tactics. What if we create an opportunity for them to slip up?" Grant raised an eyebrow. "You mean bait them?" Gabriel nodded. "If we make it look like Elena's no longer under my protection, they might get bold enough to make a move." Elena's eyes widened. "Gabriel?" "No," he said firmly, turning to her. "I won't let you be the bait. We'll use a decoy. Someone who looks like you, someone they can't hurt. Elena crossed her arms. And what if they don't take the bait? What if they wait until you're vulnerable instead? Gabriel met her gaze, his expression unyielding. Then we'll be ready. The plan was set in motion that evening. Grant hired a professional decoy, a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Elena, and arranged for her to leave the penthouse in a heavily surveilled car. Gabriel and Elena watched from the security room as the decoy exited the building. "You're sure this will work?" Elena asked, her voice low. "No," Gabriel admitted, "but it's our best shot." They watched the monitors as the decoy's car merged into traffic. For a while, nothing happened. Then, just as the car reached a quieter stretch of road, a black SUV appeared in the feed. "Grant," Gabriel said, his voice sharp, "we've got movement." "I see it," Grant replied, his team already mobilizing. "Stay here. We'll handle it." Gabriel glanced at Elena, her face pale but determined. "Are you okay?" "I will be," she said, though her hands clenched the edge of the desk. The next few hours were a blur. The SUV followed the decoy's car for several miles before attempting to force it off the road. Grant's team intervened, surrounding the vehicle and detaining its occupants. Gabriel and Elena waited anxiously for news. When Grant finally returned, his expression was grim but determined. "They're not the masterminds," he said, setting a folder on the desk. "But they're connected, hired muscle. They claim they were paid to scare you, nothing more." "Did they say who hired them?" Gabriel asked. Grant nodded. "Stephen Blackwood." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Then it's time I paid Blackwood a visit." That night, Gabriel prepared for the confrontation. Elena tried to dissuade him, but his resolve was unshakable. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, standing in the doorway of his bedroom as he buttoned his shirt. "I do," he said, turning to face her. "This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment they threatened us," she replied. "I'm coming with you." "Elena." "No," she interrupted, stepping closer. "You can't keep shutting me out, Gabriel. Not anymore." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but you stay close to me, no matter what happens." The meeting with Blackwood was arranged at a private club downtown. Gabriel and Elena arrived together, their presence sending a clear message. Blackwood was already waiting, seated in a dimly lit corner booth. "Mr. Harris," Blackwood said, his tone as smooth as ever. "And Miss Brooks? What a surprise." Gabriel didn't sit. "Cut the games, Blackwood. I know you hired those men." Blackwood's smile didn't waver. "You seem to be under a lot of stress, Gabriel. Perhaps you're imagining things." Gabriel leaned closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You can try to deny it, but I have proof, and if you don't back off, I'll make sure you and whoever you're working for regret it." Blackwood's expression darkened. "You're playing a dangerous game, Harris. So are you," Gabriel shot back. "But the difference is, I never lose." Elena stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Whatever you're trying to do, it won't work. You can't scare us into giving up." Blackwood studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You're braver than I expected, Miss Brooks. I almost admire it." Gabriel's fists clenched, but Elena placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. "This is your last warning, Blackwood," Gabriel said. "Stay away from us, or you'll find out just how dangerous I can be." As they left the club, Gabriel's mind raced. The confrontation had been a step forward, but it wasn't over. Whoever was pulling the strings wasn't finished, and neither was he. The air in the penthouse was heavy with tension. Gabriel paced back and forth in the living room, his fists clenching and unclenching as he replayed the confrontation with Blackwood. Elena sat on the couch, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression a mixture of determination and unease. "Do you think he bought it?" she asked, breaking the silence. Gabriel stopped pacing, his gaze flicking to her. "Blackwood doesn't need to buy anything. He knows exactly what he's doing. The question is, how far is he willing to go?" Elena leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "You think he'll escalate?" "Probably," Gabriel admitted, "which means we need to be ready." She frowned, her brow furrowing. "You keep saying we, but let's be honest, Gabriel. You're still trying to handle this on your own." He opened his mouth to argue, but her raised hand stopped him. "I'm not saying you shouldn't take the lead, but if we're really in this together, you need to let me help." Gabriel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And what exactly do you propose, Elena? That we take on a shadow network of threats and intimidation as a team?" Why not? She shot back, standing up. You're already a target because of your position, and now I'm in the mix because of our connection. At least let me do something useful instead of sitting here like a hostage. Her words hit him harder than he expected. Gabriel crossed the room, standing just a few feet from her. I don't see you as a hostage. Then stop treating me like one, she said, her voice softening, but no less resolute. The next morning, Gabriel met with Grant to discuss their next steps. Elena insisted on being part of the conversation, sitting beside Gabriel at the conference table while Grant laid out their options. We've tracked Blackwood's recent movements, Grant began. He's meeting with someone tomorrow at a private airfield just outside the city. It could be his employer or someone else involved in this. Gabriel nodded, his jaw tightening. Then we intercept him. Grant raised an eyebrow. That's risky. We don't know who he's meeting, and if they suspect we're onto them, it could make things worse. I don't care, Gabriel said. I want answers, and I'm not waiting for them to come to us. Elena leaned forward. What about surveillance? Can't we watch from a distance and see who he's meeting without tipping them off? Grant considered this. It's possible, but it would require precise timing and equipment. Do it, Gabriel said without hesitation. And if we find anything, we act immediately. That evening, Elena found Gabriel in his office, poring over documents and security reports. She knocked lightly on the doorframe before stepping inside. You look exhausted, she said, placing a mug of coffee on his desk. He glanced up, his expression softening. I could say the same about you, she shrugged. At least I'm not trying to take on the world by myself. A faint smile tugged at his lips. Fair point. She sat in the chair across from him, her gaze steady. You know, I've been thinking about something. What's that? He asked, leaning back in his chair. This isn't just about your business or me, she said. Whoever is behind this, they're targeting what you care about. They're trying to break you. Gabriel's smile faded. And they think I'll let them. You won't, she said firmly. But we need to be smart about this. If we let them dictate the terms, we'll always be one step behind. He nodded slowly. You're right. So what do you suggest? We use their tactics against them, she said. Find out what they care about and make them feel the pressure. Gabriel studied her, a spark of admiration in his eyes. You're ruthless when you want to be, she smirked. I learned from the best. The next day, Grant's team set up surveillance at the airfield. Gabriel and Elena watched from a secure location as the operation unfolded. The cameras captured Blackwood arriving in a sleek black car, his demeanor as confident as ever. Moments later, another car pulled up, and a tall, imposing man stepped out. Gabriel's eyes narrowed as he recognized him. Derek Mason, he said, his tone cold. Who is he? Elena asked. A competitor, Gabriel replied. He's been trying to undercut my business for years. Grant's voice crackled over the comms. We're getting audio now, patching it through. The sound was faint at first, but it grew clearer as the microphone zoomed in on the conversation. Everything's in place, Blackwood was saying. Harris won't know what hit him. And the girl? Mason asked. She's leverage, Blackwood replied. If Harris doesn't back down, we make it personal. Gabriel's fists clenched, his jaw tightening. Elena placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. Grant's voice interrupted the tense moment. We've got enough evidence to move. Your call, Mr. Harris? Gabriel glanced at Elena, her expression resolute. He turned back to the monitor. Do it. Grant's team moved in swiftly, surrounding Blackwood and Mason before they could react. Gabriel and Elena watched as the men were detained, their protests drowned out by the shouts of security personnel. As the dust settled, Gabriel turned to Elena. This isn't over yet. Mason and Blackwood are just pawns. We need to find out who's really pulling the strings. And we will, Elena said, her voice steady. But for now, this is a win. Gabriel nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. It's a start. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. They were finally taking control, and whoever was behind this wouldn't see them coming. The following morning, Gabriel stood in his office, staring out at the sprawling skyline. The city felt smaller now, like a chessboard where every move was part of a calculated game. Mason and Blackwood had been taken into custody, but Gabriel knew the true mastermind was still out there. This was far from over. Elena entered the room, holding 2 cups of coffee. You didn't sleep, did you? She asked, setting one down on his desk. Gabriel turned to face her. the shadows under his eyes making him look even more intense. Not much. You need rest, she said, her tone firm. Running on fumes won't help anyone. I'll rest when this is done, he replied, his voice low. Blackwood and Mason aren't the end of this. They're just pieces on the board. Elena stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. Then let's figure out who's holding the strings. Together. That afternoon, Gabriel met with Grant in a secure conference room. Elena sat beside him, her determination evident. Grant placed a folder on the table and opened it to reveal a series of documents and photographs. We've been digging into Mason and Blackwood's financials, Grant began. There are payments from an offshore account tied to a shell corporation. We traced the account back to someone named Julian Mathis. Gabriel's expression darkened. Mathis? Grant nodded. He's a power broker, works behind the scenes, manipulating business deals and political moves. He's been known to ruin lives for profit. Elena leaned forward. Why would he target Gabriel? Because Harris Industries blocked one of his deals last year, Grant explained. You exposed his clients' illegal practices, and they lost millions. This is payback. Gabriel's jaw tightened. If Mathis wants a war, he'll get one. Elena touched his arm, grounding him. We need to be smart about this. If Mathis is as powerful as you say, he's not going to make mistakes. He already did, Gabriel said, his voice cold. He underestimated us. Later that evening, Gabriel and Elena reviewed the information in the folder. They worked side by side in his office, the tension between them softened by their shared focus. Mathis is untouchable, Elena said, scanning the documents, at least on paper. No one's untouchable, Gabriel replied. Everyone has weaknesses. Elena raised an eyebrow. And what's his? Gabriel smirked faintly. That's what we're going to find out. The next day, Gabriel's team began their investigation into Julian Mathis. They combed through his business dealings, personal connections, and digital footprints, searching for any leverage they could use. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Elena worked to maintain the appearance of normalcy. They attended meetings, handled press inquiries, and continued their lives as though nothing was wrong. But beneath the surface, every moment was a calculated move in their plan. One evening, as they sat on the couch reviewing a new batch of intel, Elena paused and looked at Gabriel. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Regret what? He replied, glancing at her. This life, she said. The constant battles, the enemies, the never-ending fight to stay ahead. Gabriel leaned back, his gaze steady. I didn't have much of a choice. This life, it's all I've ever known. But now? She pressed. If you could walk away, would you? He was silent for a moment, then shook his head. Not yet. Not until I know you're safe. Elena's expression softened. You don't have to carry that weight alone, Gabriel. I know, he said quietly, but I want to. The breakthrough came late one night. Grant called Gabriel with news that Mathis had scheduled a private meeting at an exclusive country club outside the city. The timing was perfect. Mathis would be away from his usual strongholds, vulnerable to surveillance. This is our chance, Grant said. If we can intercept his communications, we might find something we can use. Gabriel nodded. Do it. I want everything. The operation was precise. Gabriel's team infiltrated the country club's security system, planting devices to monitor Mathis's movements and conversations. Gabriel and Elena watched from a nearby surveillance van, their eyes fixed on the monitors. Mathis arrived, his entourage in tow. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, but Gabriel's eyes narrowed as he studied the screen. He's too relaxed, Gabriel said. He doesn't think we're a threat. Then let's change that, Elena replied. As the surveillance team recorded Mathis's conversations, they uncovered a crucial piece of information, a planned meeting with an international client tied to illegal arms deals. It was the leverage they needed. Back at the penthouse, Gabriel and Elena reviewed the recordings. The evidence was damning, enough to bring Mathis down if used correctly. This is it, Gabriel said, his voice steady. This is how we end this. Elena looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and concern. And what happens after? When this is all over? Gabriel turned to her, his expression softening. Then we figure out what comes next, together. For the first time in weeks, Elena allowed herself to believe they might finally have a way out of the chaos. But even as she smiled, a part of her knew the battle wasn't over yet. The evidence against Julian Mathis felt like a loaded weapon in Gabriel's hands. The recordings of his meeting, combined with the financial trails uncovered by Grant's team, painted a clear picture of illegal dealings. Mathis wasn't just a manipulator. He was a criminal. And now, Gabriel had the means to bring him down. Gabriel stood in his penthouse office, the city lights twinkling behind him as he reviewed the files one last time. Elena entered, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She carried 2 glasses of wine, setting one on the desk beside him. "You've been at this for hours," she said softly. "You need a break." Gabriel glanced at her, his face tired but resolute. "There's no time for a break, not until this is over." She leaned against the desk, sipping her wine. "We have everything we need. You've already won." "Not yet," he said, his voice low. "Mathis is too powerful to leave anything to chance. He's got connections, resources. If we make one wrong move, he'll bury us." Elena placed her glass down and touched his arm. "Then let's make sure we don't make a wrong move." The next morning, Gabriel and Grant met in the penthouse to finalize their plan. Elena sat with them, listening intently as Grant laid out the steps. "We'll leak the recordings to the authorities," Grant said, "but we need to time it perfectly. If Mathis catches wind of this before they move, he'll disappear." Gabriel nodded. "How long until we're ready?" 24 hours, Grant replied. "Maybe less." "Make it happen," Gabriel said firmly. "I want him behind bars." Elena leaned forward. "And what about his connections? What if they come after us?" "That's why we're doing this carefully," Gabriel said, his gaze steady. "Once Mathis is arrested, his network will fall apart. They'll turn on each other before they come for us." Elena nodded, though a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "Just promise me we'll be ready for anything." "We will," Gabriel said, his voice unwavering. Later that evening, Gabriel and Elena found themselves in the penthouse living room, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Gabriel sat on the couch, his head resting in his hands. Elena joined him, placing a hand on his back. "You've done everything you can," she said softly. "Now we just have to trust it's enough." Gabriel looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "What if it's not? What if Mathis slips through our fingers?" "Then we try again," she said, her voice steady. "You've fought too hard to give up now." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You've been my anchor through all of this, Elena. I don't know how I'd have done it without you." She smiled faintly. "You would have found a way. That's who you are." The next day, Grant's team put their plan into action. The recordings and documents were anonymously delivered to federal authorities, along with a detailed report linking Mathis to illegal arms deals. Gabriel and Elena watched from the penthouse as news of the investigation broke. "It's done," Grant said over the phone. "The authorities are moving in now." Gabriel exhaled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. "Thank you, Grant. Keep me updated." As he ended the call, Elena approached him, her eyes bright with relief. "It's over?" "Not yet," Gabriel said cautiously, "but it's a good start." Hours later, Gabriel received another call from Grant. "They've arrested Mathis," Grant reported. "The operation was clean. No leaks, no complications." Gabriel allowed himself a rare smile. "Good. And his connections?" "They're scrambling," Grant said. "Without Mathis, their entire operation is falling apart." Gabriel hung up and turned to Elena, who had been watching him anxiously. "It's done. Mathis is in custody." Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "So it's over." "For now," Gabriel said, his voice tinged with caution, "but we'll stay vigilant." Elena stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him. "You did it, Gabriel. You kept us safe." He held her tightly, his voice soft. "We did it. I couldn't have done this without you." That evening, as they sat together on the balcony, the city stretched out before them. Gabriel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The fight with Mathis had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also shown him what truly mattered. As Elena leaned her head on his shoulder, Gabriel knew that this wasn't just a victory. It was a new beginning. Together, they had faced the storm, and together, they had emerged stronger. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Gabriel's penthouse, casting a golden hue over the cityscape. The storm of the past weeks had passed, leaving behind a strange calm. Gabriel stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up below. His reflection in the glass showed a man who was no longer just a businessman, but someone who had fought for something greater than himself. and won. Behind him, Elena appeared, wrapped in a soft robe, her hair still tousled from sleep. She leaned against the doorway, watching him. "You look different," she said with a small smile. He turned to face her, raising an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Lighter," she said, stepping closer. "Like you're finally breathing again." Gabriel chuckled softly. "Maybe I am." She slid her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. "It's strange, isn't it? After everything we've been through, waking up and realizing it's over." "For now," he said, his tone cautious. "But we'll stay prepared. Mathis may be out of the picture, but there are always others waiting to take his place." Elena looked up at him, her expression steady. "And we'll face them. Together." He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "You've been my rock through all of this, Elena. I don't know how I'd have done it without you." She smiled, leaning into his touch. "You would have found a way. You always do." Later that afternoon, Gabriel and Elena took a walk through Central Park. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the distant sound of children's laughter filled the air. For the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves a moment of normalcy. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Elena asked, glancing at him. "Every day," Gabriel admitted. "I've spent my life chasing power and success, but now it feels empty compared to what we've built together." Elena raised an eyebrow. "What we've built?" Gabriel stopped walking, turning to face her. "Yes, Elena, you've shown me that there's more to life than boardrooms and bottom lines. You've given me a reason to fight for something real." She searched his face, her heart swelling at his words. "And what does real look like to you?" Gabriel smiled, a rare softness in his expression. "It looks like us, building a life together, a family, maybe, something worth protecting." Elena's breath hitched at his words. "A family?" "Yes," he said, his voice steady, "with you." That evening, back at the penthouse, Gabriel surprised Elena with a candlelit dinner. The table was set with her favorite dishes, and the faint sound of jazz played in the background. She laughed as he led her to the table, shaking her head in disbelief. "What's all this?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. "A celebration," Gabriel said simply. "For what?" "For us," he replied, pulling out her chair. "And for what comes next." As they ate, their conversation flowed effortlessly, laughter mingling with the clink of glasses. For the first time in months, the weight of their ordeal felt distant, like a memory slowly fading. After dinner, Gabriel stood and reached into his pocket. Elena's breath caught as he pulled out a small velvet box. He knelt before her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Elena," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You came into my life when I was lost. You saved me, not just that night, but in every way that matters. You've shown me what it means to love and to be loved." Her eyes filled with tears as he opened the box, revealing a simple yet elegant diamond ring. "I don't want to face another day without you by my side," he continued. "Will you marry me?" Elena's hands flew to her mouth as a soft gasp escaped her lips. For a moment, she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the depth of his words. Finally, she nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, Gabriel. Of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they stood together, their foreheads touching as they both tried to steady their emotions. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in their bubble of joy. Later, as they sat together on the balcony, Gabriel wrapped a blanket around Elena's shoulders. She rested her head against his chest, her fingers playing with the ring on her hand. "Did you always know you'd ask me?" she asked softly. "No," he admitted, "but I knew I couldn't let you go. Not after everything we've been through." She smiled, her eyes closing as she leaned into him. "I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness. Not after what I've been through." Gabriel kissed the top of her head. "You deserve it, Elena, more than anyone I've ever known." As the city lights twinkled around them, they sat in silence, content in the knowledge that they had fought for their happiness and won. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger than ever. And for the first time, Gabriel Harris truly understood what it meant to be at peace.